Good evening. On behalf of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, welcome to our remote community meeting for the order on consent for interim response action for the radioactive materials handling facility at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. My name is Michelle Banks-Sardone, and I am the DTSC Public Participation Specialist for the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. The presentation for this evening's community meeting will be available tomorrow on DTSC's SSFL webpage. We have several members joining us from the community this evening, and to address as many questions as possible within our time constraints, you have joined the meeting in listening and viewing mode. To ensure your participation, there will be a questions and answers session following this evening's presentation. If you have joined us with a mobile device, iPad, notebook, or computer, to participate, please type your question in the questions and answers section on your screen. It is typically found on the right-hand side of your screen. Your question will be read aloud by the meeting moderator and responded to by one of our presenters. We also have several community members joining us by telephone. If you are joining us by telephone, please note that there may be a 20-second delay. Additionally, if you have questions following the meeting, email, mail, or call me. Questions and responses will all be posted to the DTSC Santa Susana Field Laboratory webpage. We understand that members of the media may be with us this evening. We want to do our best to share project updates and welcome questions from the community with the time that we have available. For members of the media, please contact Russ Edmondson, our Public Information Officer at DTSC. You can reach him at 916-214-2208. That's 916-214-2208, or Russ Edmondson at dtsc.ca. Tonight's agenda will include greetings, a brief presentation, followed by questions and answers, and a wrap-up. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters for the evening. First, Grant Cope, DTSC Site Mitigation and Restoration Program Deputy Director and the Santa Susana Field Laboratory Project Director. Grant, can you say hello?
Certainly. Hello, everybody. Good evening.
We also have Stephen Becker joining us, DTSC's Northern California Site Mitigation Chief over the Santa Susana Field Laboratory and Lead Acid Battery Recycling Facility Investigation and Cleanup Program, also known as LABRIC. Steve, can you say hello, please?
Good evening, everyone.
And Laura Rainey, DTSC's Senior Engineering Geologist and the DTSC Project Manager overseeing Area 4 cleanup activities at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. At this time, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Grant.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you mostly to everybody who showed up for today's online meeting. I know these are difficult circumstances. We would like to be with you in person, but we are making the best of the situation given the constraints that are put on people during today's trying times. I want to just take a little bit of your time to go over the Department of Toxic Substances Control, the work that we do, and how that applies to the site. So DTSC is a department within the California Environmental Protection Agency. We regulate the safe management and cleanup of hazardous waste and hazardous substances in California. Our mission is to protect the people and environment of California from the harmful effects of hazardous substances by restoring contaminated resources, such as cleaning up at Santa Susana, enforcing hazardous waste laws, reducing hazardous waste generation, and also encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. Next slide, please. Let me give you an overview of Santa Susana. I'm sure this is well-trodden territory for many of you. So I'll make it brief. Santa Susana is about 2,800 acres, and over the decades that it was in operation, it did both rocket engine testing and nuclear research activities. that resulted in releases of contaminants. Those contaminants include solvents, they include heavy metals, petroleum hydrocarbons, as well as radionuclides. The thrust of DTSC's mission at this site is to protect public health and the environment through ensuring that soil and groundwater cleanup occurs that meets cleanup standards. The basis for those cleanup standards are within two documents. One is a 2007 order on consent, and a 2010 AOC. The cleanup essentially says that you have to comply with all applicable relevant appropriate laws, regulations that apply to the different contaminated media under the agreements. For soil cleanup, that is the 2007 consent order as it applies to Boeing. The 2010 administrative order on consent applies to both NASA and DOE. And then for groundwater, the 2007 consent order applies across the board. Next slide, please. Let me go over just really quickly the particular areas that the responsible parties at Santa Susana are responsible for cleaning up. So we've got Boeing, DOE, and NASA. We've broken the site up into kind of manageable areas. Boeing is responsible for cleaning up area 1, 3, and the southern buffer zone. NASA is responsible for cleaning up the liquid oxygen area in area 1, as well as area 2. And then DOE is responsible for areas 4 and the northern buffer zone. Area 4 is obviously at issue tonight, given the order. And with that, actually, I'll turn it over to Steve to discuss the order that's the topic for this evening's meeting. Steve?
Thank you, Grant. I'm Steve Becker, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what an order on consent is and discuss the rationale for the RMHF order on consent. The RMHF order for interim response at the RMHF complex is an enforceable agreement that DTSC and DOE have executed. The enforceable agreement was entered into to ensure the terms of the order are complied with by both parties. And there's a picture of the first page of the consent order on slide 6. Next slide, please. So now to talk a little bit about the rationale for the RMHF order. DTSC issued an order on consent for an interim response action to the United States Department of Energy for demolition and disposal of 10 buildings within the RMHF complex. This order allows for the near-term removal of the above-ground portions of the 10 buildings at the RMHF complex. And if you look in the upper central portion of this slide, you'll see a bright yellow box that identifies where the RMHF complex is. You'll also see some cross-hatching on this figure that identifies the approximate extent of where the Woolsey fire came through the site. Just to provide you a little background on this area, the RMHF complex was constructed in 1959 to handle new and spent nuclear fuel. In 1989, the RMHF complex was authorized for the storage and treatment of radioactive waste having a hazardous chemical component. Contamination at the RMHF complex includes radionuclides, heavy metals, solvents, oils and greases, lead-based paint, polychlorinated biphenyls, and asbestos-containing materials. Recent fires have occurred in close proximity to the RMHF area and actually scorched one of the buildings that is not part of the RMHF area that's shown on this slide as building number 4029. That occurred during the Woolsey fire. In the event of a fire followed by heavy rain, the deteriorating buildings could release contamination that could migrate off-site. It was determined that an interim response action was required due to the potential for risk from wildfires. The interim response action is consistent with the governor's executive order N-05-19, which seeks to prevent and mitigate the impact of wildfires. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Laura Rainey, who will provide additional details regarding the RMHF interim response action.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening. My name's Laura Rainey, and I'm the project manager for DTSC, working in the radioactive material handling facilities, that's RMHF, cleanup. You just heard Steve explain what an order on consent is, but what is an interim response action? An interim response action is a course of action taken prior to implementation of the cleanup remedy to reduce further migration of chemicals of concern into the environment. It is also intended to reduce or eliminate the concentration of chemicals of concern at a source area and eliminate exposure pathways. The interim response action required by the order on consent is a very focused scope, that is, demolition, removal, and off-site disposal of above-ground structures associated with the 10 buildings within the RMHF complex. This interim response action will be conducted by the United States Department of Energy, DOE, under the oversight of the Department of Toxic Substances Control. You just heard Steve explain that in the event of a fire followed by heavy rain, the deteriorating buildings could potentially release contamination that could migrate off-site. A release of hazardous substances from this area may present a danger to the public health or to the environment. Removal of these buildings will eliminate the above-ground source of the contaminants, the buildings, and thus will eliminate the potential for exposure to the contaminants. Now, why aren't we removing all the structures above and below ground? Well, the scope of this interim action is focused on removal of the above-ground structures that may be burned by the wildfire. To be clear, this is not a full cleanup, as no ground disturbance will occur, and the below-ground structures associated with the buildings will remain in place for future removal when soils cleanup occurs. This interim response action addresses the risk from future wildfires by requiring removal and off-site disposal of these buildings. Cleanup of the RMHF complex will occur in 3 phases. Phase 1 is this interim response action and will be demolition and removal of the above-ground portions of the structures. Phase 2 will involve removal and disposal of the surface asphalt, concrete, and below-ground portions of buildings 4022 and 4021. Phase 3 will occur when the soil cleanup occurs and will involve characterization and disposal of impacted soil. There are 2 types of buildings at the RMHF. There are 3 RCRA interim status permitted buildings that are undergoing RCRA closure, and there are 7 non-RCRA permitted buildings. Prior to demolition, all buildings underwent removal of hazardous constituents. These materials included asbestos-containing materials, lead-based paint, fluorescent tubes, batteries, lamp ballast, capacitors, and other regulated materials. All waste generated at RMHF was disposed of off-site out of the state of California at a licensed commercial low-level radioactive waste disposal facility as low-level radioactive waste or mixed low-level radioactive waste, and it was disposed of in a manner that is protective of human health and the environment. All RCRA wastes have been removed from the buildings. Remaining non-RCRA hazardous and potentially hazardous materials to be removed during demolition will also be disposed of at a licensed commercial low-level or mixed low-level radioactive waste disposal facility, or an authorized low-level or mixed low-level radioactive waste disposal facility at a DOE site. During demolition, the above-ground portions of the structures will be removed, but the slabs and the foundations will be left in place to provide a barrier to the soil and subsurface structures. If the buildings have below-ground structures, the below-ground foundation and walls will be left in place. Asphalt surfaces inside RMHF will also be left in place. During demolition, dust control and dust protection measures will be employed to mitigate the generation of dust. Dust control measures such as pre-watering of the building exterior and misting will be used during demolition to reduce generated dust sources. Best management practices, controls, and measures will be employed during and after demolition for control of stormwater runoff and non-stormwater runoff. Pre- and post-demolition inspections will identify and appropriately address issues such as potential for water intrusion and fixed contamination remaining on a slab that's exposed to the weather. If contamination remains on a slab and is not removable, a suitable material to prevent water accumulation on the slab will be added after demolition. Additionally, all penetrations, vaults, and entries to basements will be sealed and protected to prevent water intrusion. Any slabs with detectable radioactivity above background following building demolition will have shielding in place, such as concrete cover or metal plates, to ensure that the former building areas are left in a condition that's protective of human health and the environment. A combination of shielding and administrative institutional controls will be used to ensure that workers and members of the public do not receive exposures above background levels. The plans describing the interim response action include a standardized operating procedure for phase 1 of demolition of the facilities at RMHF, referred to as the SOP, a demolition plan, and also a RCRA closure plan for the 3 RCRA interim status permitted buildings. The order on consent covers and includes building demolition and disposal of the building debris, but it does not apply to soil cleanup activities at SSFL pursuant to the administrative order on consent or to groundwater. However, removal of these features is necessary so that we can inspect, screen, and/or sample the soil directly beneath the facilities in order to comply with the administrative order on consent. Under the order on consent, DOE will conduct building demolition activities under DTSC oversight and will dispose of the resulting building demolition debris off-site out of the state of California at a licensed commercial low-level or mixed low-level radioactive waste facility in a manner that's protective of human health and the environment. At the completion of this interim action, no above-ground buildings or debris will remain. DTSC is committed to ensuring that the RMHF complex will be left in a condition that's protective of human health and the environment until the next phase of below-ground cleanup occurs. Next slide, please. SSFL is a place of significant biological and cultural resources, and Area 4 is home to numerous cultural resources. The demolition activities will occur within the fence-line paved area of the RMHF complex and will involve no ground disturbing activities. A consultation plan will be developed with applicable tribes for purposes of ensuring appropriate tribal monitoring and avoidance processes are established. An archaeologist and Native American monitor will be provided for the demolition activities in accordance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act for decommissioning and demolition areas. Area 4 is also home to numerous endangered or threatened species and critical habitats. Local, state, and federal laws must be followed for the protection of these species and their critical habitats. Again, the demolition activities will be conducted within the fence line of the developed RMHF complex on paved land. Demolition will involve no ground disturbance. There is potential for migratory bird nesting in vegetated areas adjacent to the RMHF complex and within the RMHF buildings. An initial bird survey was conducted with the buildings, which inspected for signs of bird activity and potential nest building. No active nests were identified during the pre-demolition survey. Weekly inspections will follow with appropriate bird nesting mitigation strategies implemented. DOE has and will continue to coordinate with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that any demolition will be implemented to avoid, minimize, and/or mitigate for adverse effects on federally listed and proposed species and designated critical habitat. A mitigation and monitoring plan will be developed to reduce or avoid such impacts. Next slide, please. The RMHF complex is part of the Santa Susana Field Lab, which is comprised of 2,850 acres. It's located in Simi Hills in southeastern Ventura County. This view is looking northeast across Area 4. The RMHF complex is located within the former Energy Technology Engineering Center, otherwise known as ETEC, of Area 4. Over its operating life, over 270 structures were located within Area 4. The buildings in this picture are the remaining DOE-owned buildings within ETEC and the Boeing-owned buildings within Area 4. Next slide, please. As you can see in this picture, the RMHF is within an area of approximately 1.5 acres, and it's located within Area 4 of SSFL. The 10 buildings and structures currently comprise the RMHF complex. However, only 3 specific units are subject to the RCRA closure requirements described in the order. These are buildings 4021, previously used for treatment, building 4022, currently used for waste storage, and buildings 4621, also previously used for waste storage, and which includes the adjacent outdoor asphalt paved area. For units undergoing closure subject to RCRA requirements, closure shall be conducted in accordance with the DTSC approved RMHF RCRA closure plan and standard operating procedure. The RMHF RCRA closure plan and the standard operating procedure were made available for public comment, and the documents are being revised to address public comments received. DTSC will provide responses to the public comments when the final closure plan is issued. The RCRA units shall receive RCRA closure performance standards by demonstrating that hazardous substances have been removed, i.e. through removal of the buildings, or are left in place at levels that are controlled such that they do not pose a threat to public health and the environment. The order for the RMHF complex also addresses the remaining 7 buildings and ancillary structures on site. Ancillary structures include the above-ground filter blower system with exhaust stack located between buildings 4021 and 4022. Closure activities consisting of demolition and disposal for the 7 non-RCRA regulated units shall be conducted in accordance with a DTSC-approved SOP. Closure for these buildings and ancillary structures shall demonstrate that hazardous substances have been removed as described above for the 3 buildings subject to the RCRA closure requirements. The pre-demolition and abatement activities for these buildings has been completed. Demolition of the 7 non-RCRA permitted structures at the RMHF complex will occur first, followed by demolition of the 3 RMHF RCRA permitted buildings and structures. Routine ambient air monitoring is ongoing and will continue, along with additional air monitoring that will occur in the vicinity of the buildings during the demolition activities. Next slide, please. These are the photographs of Building 4021, which was the decontamination and packaging facility. This building was permitted for mixed waste storage and treatment. The hazardous substances associated with these buildings may represent a threat to human health through ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact exposure pathways. Complete removal of these buildings is necessary, as the deteriorating buildings have the potential to release radioactive and hazardous substances in the event of a wildfire. The buildings require removal as they are in the vicinity of vegetated areas that either have been directly impacted by wildfires or continue to be threatened by the occurrence of wildfire, which could result in impacts to the structures, resulting in the release of radioactive and hazardous substances that may migrate to soils, sediments, and air, and potentially pose a risk to the public, the environment, and on-site workers. DTSC is committed to ensuring that the demolition and removal of the above-ground buildings is conducted in a manner that is protective of human health and the environment. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of Building 4022, which is the radioactive storage building. This was previously used for reactor fuel storage and is currently used for storage. This building includes below-ground concrete vaults for radioactive materials storage. Demolition activities conducted under the order on consent will involve no ground-disturbing activities. Implementing above-ground building demolition of the RMHF interim status buildings under RCRA closure allows for an expedited cleanup of buildings that may be threatened during the fire season. Removal of the buildings will remove the threat, leaving the RMHF in a condition that's protective of public health and the environment. The remaining RCRA interim status structures within the footprint of the buildings and mixed waste storage yard will undergo demolition and removal under RMHF RCRA closure plan during future soils cleanup under the AOC. Next slide, please. DTSC recognizes the public's concern about transporting waste on public streets and highways. Such transportation requires significant safeguards of the Department of Transportation, both state and federal. The RMHF demolition plan addresses truck loading and unloading, as well as on-site and off-site transportation safety. Based on the estimated volume of waste generated, up to 100 truckloads would be required for disposal during the RMHF demolition activities. The number of loads leaving the site will be staggered and limited to 16 round-trip truckloads per day to limit disruption to the local community. Assuming the project takes up to 6 months, the average is 1 truckload leaving the site per day. The actual number of truckloads leaving the site per day will vary and will be somewhere between this minimum of 1 and the maximum of 16. And there may actually be days when no trucks will be used, and the total number of trucks per day will be consistently less than the maximum of 16. DOE will coordinate with the Boeing field coordinator to stagger the loads so as to cause the least amount of disruption to the residents along Woolsey Canyon Road. In general, the drivers will avoid peak hours and will not depart earlier than 7 a.m. and not later than 4 p.m. We currently expect trucks to begin transporting waste starting around the 3rd week of July or so of 2020. Due to the sensitivity of transporting low-level radioactive waste, details on the routes is limited. The routes through the local area, however, will vary to minimize the impact on neighborhoods, and the routes will utilize the 118 and or the 101 freeways. Next slide, please. Regarding the schedule for the RMHF interim response action, the order on consent was signed May 19, 2020. The order on consent requires that DTSC review and approve plans associated with the interim response action. These plans include the SOP for Phase 1 demolition of facilities at the RMHF. This is in the process of approval. The demolition plan for the RMHF complex is to have DTSC concurrence by June 19, 2020, and the RMHF RCRA closure plan is to have DTSC approval by July 19, 2020. At the completion of Phase 1, post-demolition inspections will be conducted and the site will be placed in an interim site configuration that's protective of human health and the environment. It will result in no exposure to the public of radioactivity above background. The interim status configuration will be maintained until the remainder of the below-ground structures are removed when soil cleanup occurs. The order on consent requires an evaluation of the site to be performed 1 year from the completion of demolition. The findings will be submitted in an annual evaluation of the performance of the site restorative measures for the building demolition sites. In all, the demolition activities for the RMHF complex are estimated to take approximately 6 months total for completion. DTSC is committed to ensuring that the demolition activities are conducted in a manner that is protective of the area for environment and the neighboring communities. Thank you for your time. And now I hand this over to Michelle.
Without the order on consent or Santa Susana Field Laboratory, please give me a call or email me with your questions or concerns. My contact information is available on the screen. My email is michelle2ls.banks-ordone@dtsc.ca.gov. Or you can reach me by phone at 818-717-6573. Again, that's 818-717-6573. We would like to hear from you tonight. As we enhance our remote meeting formats and the technology we use, we would like you to complete the evaluation for this evening's this evening's meeting. You can do so if you're joining us online. If you have a mobile device and a QR code reader, there is a QR code on your screen. At this time, you can use your QR code reader, place it up to the screen, and the evaluation should pop up on your mobile device. We'll wait for 1 moment, and then we'll move on to our question and answer session. Do not worry, we will come back to this slide, and you can continue to do so throughout the question and answer session. Also note that the survey will be available until Friday of next week. To provide as much time as possible for question and answers, we'll move on. Please type your question in the question and answer section on your screen. Again, that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that your questions will be read aloud by our meeting moderator, Marcia Rubin, DTSC's Public Participation Chatsworth Office Regional Manager, and responded to by one of our presenters. Again, we do understand that there may be members of the media present with us. If you are, we ask that you please contact Russ Edmondson, DTSC's Public Information Officer, at russedmondson@dtsc.ca.gov, or you can call him at 916-323-3372. At this time, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Marcia, and we'd like to hear from you. Marcia?
Thanks, Michelle. Our first question comes from Lori, and this is about the site cleanup itself. So I'm going to ask Laura to answer this question. How can anyone think that removing buildings is sufficient enough to clean up the entire site with contaminants?
Thank you for your question. That's a very good one. This is actually an early action. It's an interim response action. It's the beginning of the cleanup. We need to remove the above ground structures due to the threat of potential wildfire. That first step by the removing of the above ground structures will allow us in the future to remove the remaining below ground structures to complete closure. And in doing so, we then can commence with the cleanup of soil. In order to get to the soil, we need to get the structures out. So it's a very important first step, and it needs to be done in a timely manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. This is also about the cleanup. So I'm going to ask for this area. So I'm going to ask Laura to address this again. This question was posed anonymously. There have been many heavy rains since the construction of SSFL. So it is likely that ecological resources, groundwater, and inhabitants are already intoxicated. How will the surrounding areas be detoxified?
Well, the key point here, I think, is in terms of thinking of, what might be contaminating the surrounding areas. And that's really the heart of what we're getting at here is the concern of as long as you have buildings with contamination that are deteriorated and in the threat of a fire, the concern is that there could potentially be, due to the damage or release of hazardous substances, that might impact these surrounding areas. So by removing these buildings, this is a very critical and important first step towards the ultimate cleanup of the site to meet the administrative order on consent. And it's a timely cleanup that needs to be done. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Laura. This question appears to be a question about the timeline for phase for the overall project. So I'll read it, and then Laura or Steve, you two can determine between the two of you which is who is the best person to answer it. From Jenny Knack, what is the timeline for phase 2 and more importantly, phase 3, which includes soils of the cleanup?
Steve, would you like me to take it or do you want to take it?
Yes, why don't you take that one, Laura?
Okay. Yes, that's a very good question. The next step would be, of course, as I said, the removal of low-grade structures. Since these are deep structures and soil needs to be disturbed, the timing is such that we will need to have the EIR needs to be finalized. The next step is for us to complete closure under the closure plan, closely in coordination with the soil cleanup, which would be under the EIR. With that, we would need to have a soils remedial action and implementation plan that's required as a decision document under the administrative order on consent. So basically, phase 2 would happen first, and then phase 3 would need to be very close in timing of that. I think I would say that because of that association and timing, we need to see, in terms of the progress of getting the EIR finalized so that we can then move forward with these next few phases.
I have what looks like more of a comment. So I will read this from Denise Duffield, and Laura or Steve, if you want to address it, I'll leave that to you. Part 2.4, and that the contaminated soil and vegetation in it present an even greater risk to health. Boeing reported 57 exceedances over pollution limits and stormwater runoff after the Woolsey fire, including lead, dioxin, cyanide, and alpha radioactivity. So it's a multi-part question. Sorry. The question box, I believe, has a limit. So forgive me if they're coming in. They're coming in out of order. This is part 4 of 4. So maybe we can focus on this. Part 4 of 4. So DTSC. What is DTSC doing to force DOE to comply with the full AOC? which it's repeatedly said it won't follow?
Hey, I can jump in. This is Grant. So the RMHF order is consistent with the 2010 AOC. We have that as the baseline requirement because it's required under the agreement that applies to the site. All the work that will be done pursuant to this order, we will do oversight on to ensure that they're complying with the 2010 AOC. And going forward, as we've repeatedly said, we will hold all the responsible parties accountable for complying with the 2010 AOC to the soils cleanup for DOE and NASA, as well as the 2007 consent order for Boeing and soils cleanup, and then for groundwater generally. These are responsible parties. They conducted activities that have contaminated the area. They're responsible for complying with the agreements that apply. We're there to do the oversight to ensure that they do that.
Thanks, Grant. Okay, the next question comes from Christina Walsh. How can leaving the vaults beneath the RMHF behind be consistent with the AOC, which does not permit landfilling?
So this is Steve. I can take that one. So the vaults at this point, this is an interim action, and the first phase of it is to remove the above ground structures. And as discussed earlier, the vaults and any subsurface features will be sealed off at this point to prevent infiltration of any water or anything else, and they will be dealt with at a later time. So the long-term plan is not to leave them in place.
Thanks, Steve. This is for Laura, again, regarding the cleanup. And it's coming in anonymously. We understand that removal of the buildings will help mitigate fire risk and off-site migration. But what about the surrounding vegetation? What happens if that burns? Are those areas free of contamination?
The burning of vegetation we can talk to in terms of, we did have the Topanga fire in 2005. Then it was followed by the Woolsey fire. We've had extensive monitoring throughout the area due to each DTSC responded, contacted multi-agencies, and sampled a variety of media. And the findings were presented in the Woolsey fire report. So when you think of combustion, that's already occurred during fires that consume quite a bit of most of the vegetation throughout Area 4. The findings of the Woolsey fire showed that no contaminants from SSFL migrated out into the neighborhood. So that would suggest that the vegetation that we've seen burnt doesn't provide that pathway. This action we're talking about is about, the source of contaminants being the buildings themselves. And then the urgency there is if those buildings are encountered with fire, the potential for the spread of contaminants. So we want to address that at this point. But that's a good question.
Thanks, Laura. I believe this one will also be for you. It comes from Michaela Partington. I am concerned that there has been no mention about cleaning up the contaminated soil to the agreed upon 2010 AOC standards. The soil at the site is what poses a health risk to the surrounding communities.
That's a very good question, and I guess bring it back to the concept of what we're talking about tonight is removing the above ground buildings. This is part of RCRA closure. RCRA closure will require removal of all the buildings above ground and below ground and any residual contaminants from that RCRA permitted facility in the soil. So it'll involve removal of soil as well. And under the AOC, that removal of soil will be to background. But as I mentioned earlier, it really is a phased approach. Phase 1 being an early action now due to the threat of fire. However, it will be followed up by removal of below ground structures under the closure plan. And again, if closure is completed, when you can prove you meet the demonstration standard for closure performance, and that is you've achieved conditions that are protective of human health and the environment. On top of that, when we clean the soils, we'll not only need to meet the closure standards that are protective, but we'll also have to achieve and demonstrate that we've met cleanup to background. So it's just a matter of phasing, but the end point, the end result under the AOC for soils will absolutely be cleanup to background as well as a condition that's protective of human health in the public and the communities.
Thanks, Laura. Our next question is related to funding. With the current COVID-19 financial impact, do you expect the budget to further decrease? Will there be a commitment of funding to complete all toxic soil and holding tank removal?
So I can jump in and just kind of flesh that out a little bit. So we have responsible parties at this site, Boeing, NASA, and DOE, and they're responsible for paying for the cleanup activities, the investigation activities that are required in order to fully characterize the extent of release of contaminants and then to address those contaminants under the applicable orders. So they're responsible for essentially reimbursing us for our oversight, for paying for contractors who will do the work, and in terms of obviously the state of California is experiencing some significant reductions in projected revenue as a result of the measures being undertaken to reduce the transmission of COVID. I can tell you that this week I've increased the amount of resources going from DTSC into this project in order to ensure that the significant workload that the staff has been shouldering is more broadly distributed, and therefore we can get the work done at a much faster clip. Those are just internal reallocation of resources, but we're doing everything we can to ensure that the team that's working on this is well resourced, and we will use those resources to conduct oversight on whatever activities occur that need to occur in order for investigation and cleanups to take place.
Thanks, Grant. This question is about the Woolsey fire. So, Laura, I think this question would be for you. Weren't air samples taken from the Woolsey fire occur after the fire was put out?
Yes, that's a good question. Regarding air sampling, there was as air sampling occurred in response to the Woolsey fire. So the team that did the investigation that DTSC contacted for investigating, there were air samples taken by multiple parties. In addition, and that was in the neighborhood areas as well as SSFL. At SSFL, we had air monitoring going on for establishing baseline air conditions. This had already been started. It was in progress. When the fire came, we already had some data. Some of the stations continued to collect data during the fire, and then the stations continued to collect data after the fire. So there, we have a significant data collected both before, during, and after the fire. Now, in terms of wanting to see, let's see what the question, make sure I'm answering your question. Air samples taken from the Woolsey fire occur after the fire was put out, which defeats the purpose of taking air samples to see if contaminants were present in the air if they weren't taken while the fire was burning. Okay, so I think probably the most important aspect of this is that we had data both before, during, and after the fire because of the baseline air monitoring network. It's a series of perimeter air monitoring stations that surrounds the Santa Susana Field Lab. DOE did comparisons before, during, and after the fire conditions, and they found essentially that the air monitoring results showed no significant difference. So that doesn't necessarily defeat the purpose of taking air samples if you actually can take and get data to represent those different time periods. The air monitoring is continuing. That monitoring network around the perimeter continues to this day to keep getting the air data that we need. That will prove valuable for the future cleanup efforts. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I have one that came in on the chat rather than the Q&A from William Preston Bowling. What is the extent of the damage of building 409? As in your presentation tonight, you claimed that it was scorched in the 2018 Woolsey fire. So it sounds like the question is, what is the extent of damage to building 4029?
Yes, I can take that. The building 4029, it's a relatively small facility, but it's one of the RCRA permitted facilities outside of RMHF. It's a separate permitted facility. I went there in the spring after the fire, and while during the fire map that was generated shows the building is within the boundary of the fire. You can see as I went to that location, the fire came right up to the driveway of the asphalt. It burns literally inside the fence line, up to the asphalt driveway, up to the edge of the building. By the time I was there, heavy rains had occurred and there was lush vegetation. I saw no burn marks on the building. However, DOE observed some scorch marks right after the fire. The building itself is abutted up against a steep, large rock outcrop, and that outcrop slopes to the north, and there's some vegetation on the sloping rock. So I suspect the fire came up and then jumped over, and undoubtedly ash and embers went up and landed on the outcrop behind it, which is between the roadway and the building itself. So while it was in the entirely within the mapped burn area, the damage to the building itself was so minimal to the extent that we didn't even see it when we arrived in the springtime. But it definitely burnt right up to the edge of it.
Yeah, and this is Grant. I'm going to just jump in to build on what Laura said. This is California. Fire is part of the ecosystem at Santa Susana and other areas throughout California. The difference here is that with climate change, we are seeing hotter, longer fires than we've ever experienced before, more destructive fires than we've ever experienced before. All the models that we use in the state to take a look at the future also tell us it's going to get worse. We're doing the work that we can now on a worst case first basis to get rid of the above ground structures so that we're eliminating potential threats. This is an important first step. It's not the last step. It's an important first step as it relates to these buildings. But we don't want to risk another fire coming through there where, potentially the outcome is far different. We want to address these threats head on when we find them using the tools that we can, and we will take early action now. We will take early action in the future, as long as it's within the bounds of the law, to address threats that protect public health and the environment.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Grant. Our next question comes from Christina Walsh. When will a full inventory of the contents and contamination levels of the vaults and remaining slabs prior to demolition be starting?
I can take that. The pre-demolition activities include going through and observing and inventorying all the buildings with respect to hazardous substances so that they can be removed during abatement. That has been completed, so abatement's done. All the RCRA waste is removed from all the buildings at the RMHF complex. Deactivation will be starting in the latter part of June, mid to latter part of June, and that's really just removing the remaining materials such that what's left is basically the shell of the buildings so that the metal sidings and roofs and whatnot can be then demolished and dismantled. So the inventories have already been done. That information was the basis for understanding what hazardous materials need to be removed. There's some hazardous materials do remain that can only be removed at the time when we take the metal part of the buildings apart. For example, asbestos sealant in between the metal sidings. So that's the action of the above ground removal. And I know you're asking about the below grade inventory of what's in the vaults themselves. We've seen there's documented a number of RAD surveys show the conditions of the vaults. We have that on record, but we're not removing that right now. That will be sealed from any intrusion for water. And as I said, that will be removed at a future date as we get closer to soils cleanup. It is radioactively contaminated. The surveys show that. There's quarterly surveys have been done for the RMHF structures, and those vaults are part of one of the RCRA permitted mixed waste. So there was radioactive waste storage in those vaults.
Thanks, Laura. Our next question comes from Martha Stewart-Waite, and it's related to public participation, so I'll pose this to Michelle. Will you have weekly or at least monthly meetings like this to update residents on the cleanup progress?
Thank you for the question. We will have updates not only in our monthly reports, but also in work notices that will be going out to the community. And as we enhance our remote meeting capabilities, we also will be having additional meetings remotely. The timing on the meetings have yet to be set, but we will be notifying you in our work notices as well as our monthly reports.
Thanks, Michelle. And this is about the RMHF building removal, so I will pose it to Laura. It comes from Gary Schwimmer, and the question is there a document that can be provided that will list all of the contaminants that will be removed with the RMHF building removal and what will be left there?
Yes, there actually is. There is the building was a building hazardous materials survey. It was conducted before demolition. The survey evaluated the hazardous constituents through all the buildings throughout the RMHF. We can post that. You can see it. There also was a closeout, and primarily the things that were removed consisted of, in terms of volume, asbestos-containing materials were probably the highest volume of bulk materials removed from these structures. It occurs in a variety of materials from tile, mastic, caulking, sealant, gaskets. In addition to that, we have lead-based paint. There's also mercury. There's batteries. So that type of material has now been removed. As I mentioned earlier, the abatement's complete. So we can post that information for you to see that these are the hazardous materials that have been removed from the buildings. There will be continuing to be some materials removed during the actual demolition. At the end of demolition, there'll be a demolition closeout report, and that will have the findings from those activities.
Thanks, Laura. So this question comes from Chris Rowe, and as it relates to Area 4, I will pose it to Laura. Why didn't DTSC require an imminent and substantial endangerment order for the Area 4 above ground structures after the 2005 Topanga fire?
The 2005 Topanga fire was really our first, at least for me, the first experience to see the fire affecting the site. We've now since seen several more fires come through. So as what you heard Grant say is the frequency, the intensity of these fires, the magnitude of the areas that they impact has just increased substantially to the point where now we recognize that and we're taking action. I think, after the 2005 fire, we didn't have that behind us. Now that we see this pattern and the urgency, we are taking action now.
Thanks, Laura. This question is also for you. It's from Michaela Partington. What is the estimated timeline for the cleanup phases?
What is the estimated timeline for the cleanup what?
Phases.
Oh, phases? Well, let's see. The first phase is this demolition for the above ground structures. So the timeline would be starting in the deactivation would start around mid-June, the latter part of June. That would be completed, and I think it's actually more like 13 days. So we're now looking at early to mid-July for the actual demolition. That will take approximately a total 6 months duration. So we're looking towards the end of the year of 2020 to complete phase 1. Phase 2, I don't have a start date, so I can't tell you the start date, but I can just say that that would consist of the demolition of the below grade structures for 4021 and 4022. We do have estimates on the time frame for that, I believe, in our EIR. I would have to take a look, and I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head how long it would take to demolish those below grade structures. One of the things that needs to happen before that does occur, though, is we do need to work on identifying fill material to fill where those vaults come out. They'll result in an excavation. We will not leave any excavations opened at the time we're complete. So that will take some effort to get that accomplished under the AOC. So I apologize, I can't tell you when phase 2 will occur, but it will occur, and then shortly after it should be coordinated with phase 3 when the soil cleanup occurs.
Thanks, Laura. This question is from Chris Rowe, and it's related to our, I guess, project team. So I will, I'll pose this to Steve or Grant. Either of you, I think, could take this. Is there a health physicist on this call?
This is Steve. We do not have a health physicist on this call. DTSC does have a health physicist, but they are not on this call this evening that I'm aware of.
All right. Thanks, Steve. So this question is about the AOC from Martha Stewart Waite. What about the AOC from 2010? Why was that not enforced by DTSC? So I think I would pose this to Grant.
Yeah, excellent. I can take that. Thanks for the question. So this order is one of the examples of DTSC enforcing the 2010 AOC. This action is required under the 2010 AOC. The actions that will be taken in the demolition of the above grade structures are consistent with the 2010 AOC. So it's yet another example of, and we've told the RPs this, we've told DOE this, we've told NASA this. We are going to enforce the AOC. The AOC is legally applicable to this area, and this order for the RMHF is utterly consistent with enforcing the 2010 AOCs.
Thank you, Grant. This question is related to public participation, so I will pose it to Michelle. Chris Rowe asks, when you send out documents, do you always notice the community if a public comment is due and when?
We always notice, particularly if it's a public comment period. I do want to clarify for everyone, this community meeting is being held and there is no requirement for a public comment period or a comment period. Typically it's 30 days. Sometimes those can be extended.
Thanks, Michelle. This question is from Michael Rincon, and it's a question, Laura or Grant, you might want to decide which of you two wants to take this. It's, how does this new order differ than what is already required by the language of the AOC for DOE?
I can jump in. It doesn't. It's all of the activities that are going to take place under the order that we're talking about today are actions that are required by the 2010 AOCs. So in terms of the work that would be done, it's utterly consistent. The reason for the order, I think as Laura and I have referred to this evening, is the threat posed by either wildfires or other stochastic events. And we need to take that threat very seriously. I think everybody in the state, in fact, the nation, has seen the severity of the wildfires that have burned through, that have ripped through California communities and caused huge amounts of damage. So this is an example of us enforcing the 2010 AOCs and taking early action to conduct cleanup activities where we can, that's consistent with the requirements that would apply to those activities.
Thank you, Grant. This question is related to this order, so I will pose it to Laura. Charlene Rothstein asks, what are the truck routes from the site to the 101?
Well, the truck routes will have to leave the hill, so they will be going down Woolsey Road. Then from there out to the freeway, we don't provide specific truck routes, as they will vary through the area, through various streets that are authorized for truck traffic. So I can't give you a specific map showing what actual route, because I think, the point is to minimize the impacts on the communities, that different routes would be applied at different times. But they will be on streets where trucking is authorized, and they will avoid peak hours. So I apologize, I can't give you a map. I can't give you a unique specific route, but that kind of is the point, to reduce the impact, just kind of spread out the truck routes through various routes.
Thanks, Laura. This question is also for you, from Chris Rowe. Did the DOE air monitors work during and after the Woolsey fire?
There were, so DOE had four air monitoring stations, one of which was damaged and rendered inoperable. So they did have the perimeter air monitoring that they were doing, the baseline air monitoring I spoke of earlier. Those did work. In addition to that, they had two additional air monitoring stations on site where they already they've been doing their own environmental air monitoring through their own environmental program. So yes, they did have wide coverage for air monitoring through the fire.
Thanks, Laura. This is from Martha Stewart Waite regarding DOE and the AOC. So I'll pose it to you as well, Laura. Why is DTSC not enforcing that DOE comply with the AOC that required all soil be removed? Or maybe that's for Grant. I'll let the two of you decide.
Yeah, I can take it, and then Laura, go ahead and fill in. So this is the first step that needs to be taken in order for soils to be cleaned up under the AOCs. It's a very methodical, very structured approach to conducting cleanup. In this respect, it's no different from any other building that needs to be cleaned up. It's just there's serious contamination there. You can't do everything all at once, so you have to be methodical in your approach. You've got to take out the above grade structures first. You don't want to take out the foundation first, because obviously then the structure would be unstable. It would risk the health and safety of workers who are conducting the work. So this is just a methodical way of implementing the activities that are required under the 2010 AOCs. These are interim actions, they're not final actions. As you heard Laura say earlier, we're going to continue to march down the path of implementing the AOCs, taking down the above grade structures, then taking down the below grade structures, then doing the soil cleanup. Laura, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that we're not only accomplishing what's legally required for RCRA closure, but that doesn't preclude also having the administrative order on consent requirements for cleanup met as well. The end goal is that you're seeing the AOC, which is cleanup to background. We'll see that will be complied with just as much of as RCRA closure will be. And in the end, when the above grade buildings are taken out, they won't be there anymore. There'll be no more debris. So with no buildings, and that's essentially saying background in the sense from the building perspective. And then we'll continue along that line until we complete the total cleanup from RCRA closure. And that will, as it again, go side by side with soil cleanup under the AOC. The two go hand in hand with each other. And the end result is a cleanup to background as well as a cleanup that's protective of human health and the environment.
Thanks, Laura. This question is about soil cleanup, so I'll pose it to you as well. Can soil cleanup begin in areas away from the buildings simultaneously?
Well, they can. It's just that there's a stepwise approach under the administrative order on consent, and that requires, in order for soils cleanup to occur, we first need to have a soil remedial action implementation plan submitted by DOE. In order to get that to happen, we need to approve that there's a chemical data summary report. So there's a document that shows, how all the investigation was completed and the data. We reviewed that, that's online. Once we approve that, when the EIR gets finalized, then the soil remedial action implementation plan gets submitted, then that's available for public review and comment. Once that gets finalized, then we start the soils cleanup. So it's a sequence of steps that needs to occur. We can't wait for all that to occur for this building cleanup to occur, so we're proceeding ahead. But those other steps do need to happen so that we can get the soil cleanup started.
Thanks, Laura. This next question is also related to our oversight of this order. It's from Gary Schwimmer, and the question is, Building 4022, 4563, and 4075 are radioactive waste storage areas. So it seems to me there needs to be detailed information about the safety of those areas during and after the removal of whatever buildings still are there today? Will you provide analysis of the area during the process?
Okay, that's a great question. In terms of the procedures for the demolition, we will be providing online, once we approve it, there'll be the standard operating procedures for phase 1 of demolition of those buildings. That lays out the framework of how the work will be conducted. That will be posted online for you to see. As part of that, within the SOP, you'll see that a number of elements of the program will be in place. One is there will be pre-demolition inspections for all the buildings, as well. In addition to that, there will be a health and safety program for all the workers. As part of that health and safety program, there'll be monitoring and mitigation to ensure that we not only understand what there's an activity hazards analysis to understand what the hazards are so that they can be mitigated for the protection of the workers. So there's a number of elements that collectively make up the standard operating procedure. So we currently have online the draft. We're working on updating it. We received a lot of public comments during the closure plan and SOP review. So please take a look at that. And then, as I said, when the work is done, there will be reports that will come out summarizing the results of the activities. And after they're done with the demolition, an important element you'll see, and it's actually described in the order on consent, and that is there'll be a post-demolition survey. So we talked about a pre-demolition survey, then they do demolition, then there's a post-demolition survey. Well, it'll include a radiological survey. If there's any radiological findings from the survey that are in excess of background, there will be mitigation applied in terms of there would be shielding. So that could be, for example, concrete may be placed over as cover of the areas having the radiation, or it might be metal plates. We also would seal these areas to prevent any for the subsurface structure so no water gets in. So the end result will be based on the post-demolition surveys. There'll be mitigation so that they'll ensure that there's no exposure to ionizing radiation above background to the public or to the workers on the site. The area will be secured and protected and posted as well.
Thanks, Laura. I have a question from Tiffany Ruiz, and it was posted in the chat, so you're not going to see it posted in our Q&A. And this question is related to public participation, so I will pose it to Michelle. In what manner are residents going to be informed about the cleanup? In what manner are residents going to be informed about the first phase of this overdue cleanup?
This community meeting is really the first attempt to ensure that residents know what is happening and what's going on around them. Subsequently, and on a more consistent basis, when I refer to work notices, those are really updates that we will be posting via email blast, posting to the DTSC Santa Susana Field Laboratory website so that you'll be able to see that as well. So we want to make sure that it's constant. We want to make sure that you're able to see it in the mediums that you've used before. The monthly updates will also include the information as well. And feel free, I have my contact information on the screen. It will remain there unless we have a question that needs to go back to a different slide. Please be sure to jot this information down if you do not have it handy. In addition, if you are not on our email list or signed up to receive our information, I would ask that you go to our website and please do that.
Thanks, Michelle. This one comes from Chris Rowe. What about the Boeing structures in Area 4? Shouldn't DTSC go to court and request the ruling to allow the removal of Boeing structures as well due to fire risk? I will pose this to Grant.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we are dealing in a kind of worst case first scenario. We know the contamination in these structures is very significant. We know that fire has swept through these areas, scorching building. So we want to deal with this in a very methodical fashion. we will move on to other buildings, whether it be Boeing or other DOE buildings. But right now we're focused on this. In terms of the work being done on Boeing and on the Boeing buildings with respect to the litigation, those are ongoing discussions with the litigants. I can't really get into the discussion about the particulars with the litigation, but your question is well placed. We have our eye on ensuring that all the buildings go through the appropriate process to be demolished consistent with the 2010 AOCs, and that the cleanup continues, once again, consistent with the AOCs.
Thanks, Grant. And this is a question about the soils cleanup, so I'll pose it to Laura. Christina Walsh asks, since cleanup of soils has not occurred, how can they be removed without thorough and independent investigation?
Well, the cleanup of soils will be based on the findings of a very extensive investigation that was conducted both by US EPA for radiological investigation in Area 4, as well as the co-located chemical investigation formed with DOE and DTSC's oversight. That was a very comprehensive investigation. It's summarized in the Chemical Data Summary Report. Upon our approval of that document, we will then have a soil remedial action implementation plan. That document will describe the full soils cleanup under the AOC requirements for both radionuclides and chemicals. Following the cleanup, as provided in the soils remedial action implementation plan, there is a confirmation protocol spelled out under the AOC that calls for US EPA to play a role in the confirmation process if funding allows. So in a sense, they provide that third party confirmation. That's a good question. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. This question is for Grant from Chris Rowe. How can we have confidence that someone qualified to consider radiological risk is involved with this project?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the question. We have technical experts within DTSC that have decades of experience. In terms of confidence in that, we don't say that you should, trust us, right? We're here because we are experts in implementing the 2010 AOCs and the 2007 consent order. That's our job. That's what we're doing. The proof is in the pudding. We will do oversight on DOE. We will do oversight on NASA. That is where we have to demonstrate to the RPs that, we're here to ensure that we are going to enforce the 2010 AOCs. We are going to check and double check. And let me tell you, this team has done a tremendous amount of work just on this one order alone in terms of ensuring that all the ducks are in a row so that when the work actually begins, we know how it's going to occur and that it is consistent. We're not demanding that you trust us. Our job is to enforce these requirements, and that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Grant. And this question would also be for you from Michaela Partington. Will DTSC ensure that the cleanup will be done by all parties, NASA, DOE, and Boeing?
Hey, Michaela. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. This question is from Earl Soros, and it's for Laura. I'm interested in protective covers of contaminated surfaces to be left post-demolition. I heard Laura mention physical covers, but I want to know about the use of fixative materials for radioactively contaminated surfaces for fixed and removable contamination.
Well, I do know that there currently is within building 4021, they've applied that type of fixative material. Beyond that, I would say in terms of what we're looking at for after demolition and removal of those buildings, the slabs and this remaining surface, as I said, it would be surveyed, and the concept of shielding would be applied if we had radiation above background. In the event if they're contaminated areas as well, there would be a suitable material could also be placed on the concrete to prevent water from building up or accumulating on such a material. I can't give you the details on what that actual material is, the fixative material, but this would be to prevent anything that's removable from being washed off and getting into the surface water runoff.
Thanks, Laura. This question is about informing the public. It's from Lori. Shouldn't there be flyers sent to residents describing what is going on and when, just in case they are not aware of all of this?
Thank you. We did have our initial mailer, and with the work notices, those are flyers that are available. In terms of mailing, that's a very good idea. We typically do our large-scale mailings when we have milestone events. Our mailing list is over 5,000 strong. So at milestone events, that is certainly something beyond email blasts, beyond our public noticing in the newspaper that we will review. That would be a substantial mailing, and that's something we do when we hit milestones. So at a milestone, we certainly would like to look at that.
Thanks, Michelle. And this question is also about public participation, so I'll pose it to you as well. Martha Stewart Waite asks, will there be public notification of any accident spills throughout phases of the cleanup?
Excellent question. Thank you. In those work notices, what we do is not only explain to you what is occurring on site, what we also will explain is if there have been any discoveries, if there have been any incidents, what we did to cure an incident. If in fact there is an incident, that is such a milestone event that we certainly would want to notify residents in the vicinity, and that would call for something to ensure that we update you and perhaps have a meeting such as this. So those are situations in which we do broader outreach and would do that. But yes, your work notice will give you all of that information.
Thank you. This question I think would probably be best answered by Grant. It's about the consent DOE's agreement to the AOC. This comes from Melissa Bumstead. Has the DOE recommitted themselves to the 2010 AOC by agreeing to this consent order?
So thanks for the question. DOE has agreed to all the steps under this order, RMHF, that are required under the 2010 AOCs. That is our job to ensure that those requirements are met, that DOE meets those requirements. That's what we've done in this order. That's what we will continue to do. I'm not certain what you mean by recommitted. What I would say is we don't just take any responsible party's word for it. What we have to do is our job, which is doing oversight and ensuring every day that we are reviewing all the relevant material, looking at all the data, and if we find a problem, we make them fix it. And if they don't fix it, we fix it for them. And it's our job ultimately to ensure that they are held accountable for complying with the agreements. That's why we're
here. This question comes from Sally Ann, and it's about cultural heritage. So I'll pose this question to you as well, Grant. You said that all of the area is a place of special cultural heritage. So could NASA, Boeing, or DOE use this as a way not to clean up to background levels?
So that's a very good question. I'm sure, as many people on this phone know better than I, this area is it contains a tremendous number of extremely culturally relevant artifacts, right? Native American artifacts. The 2010 AOCs already allow for those Native American artifacts that are, I think, formally recognized as cultural resources. I think it's something to that effect is what the AOC says. To go through a process of being preserved. So that is already contemplated in 2010 AOCs. So in terms of the cultural relevance of the area, 100%. We want to show and will show a huge amount of respect, a great amount of respect for those cultural resources. We also recognize that 2010 AOCs provide for their protection. I guess I will not put words in your mouth, but I'll use my own words. Does that mean it's a get out of jail free card? No. Once again, it's a methodical process of respecting Native American resources, Native American artifacts that are formally recognized as cultural resources. And it's a methodical process that we will undergo. It's not a get out of jail free card.
Thanks, Grant. This question was posed anonymously, and it's about the building demolition. And so I'll pose it to Laura. Who is going to be doing the building demolition? A contractor or a self-performed effort by NASA, Boeing, or DOE?
Well, one of the operators, there's two operators for the Rick Interim status facility at the RMHF, and one is DOE and the other operator is Northwind. Northwind is the contractor. They will have the lead in doing the demolition activities, and they will have subcontractors. The documents we talked about that describe the procedures for the demolition work, you'll see there are sections in there that describe who these subcontractors are and what their roles are.
Thanks, Laura. This question is about the transportation routes from Anthony C. Sears. Has the transportation route for the full cleanup been decided?
When you say for the full cleanup, I would say that the transportation for the demolition of the above ground structures has already been in place, in the sense that there's been abatement and the hazardous materials from those buildings has been removed. Trucks have transported that waste from the hill to the facilities. They're all going as low-level radioactive waste, and that is to Clive, Utah. It's Energy Solutions, Clive, Utah. So the route essentially is from Santa Susana to Clive, Utah. How they get there locally to the freeway, as I said, it's various routes. So there's no unique route. And there's, as far as the highways, it's already predetermined. The truck drivers coordinated. They're in careful communication with the dispatches. So yes, the routes are there, they're established, but there's no unique route in the local neighborhoods to provide. And that's just for this above ground early action cleanup.
Thanks, Laura. This question I will pose to Grant from Chris Rowe. Is the litigation against DTSC preventing the EIR from being completed?
I just want to make sure I heard that. Is the litigation preventing work on the EIR? Is that what it was? Absolutely not. We're working on the EIR, even as we speak. These actions are all happening concurrently. This isn't a tremendously complex site. It's one of the most complex sites that we have in the state. And it's a huge state with a long history of industrialization, work during the Cold War, whether it be at Santa Susana or elsewhere. There's a huge number of sites across the state that we're working on. This is one of the more complex sites. So, while I talked earlier about a methodical stepwise approach, that methodical stepwise approach is being taken on a whole array of actions. This order is an important interim action. But we're moving forward to complete the PEIR even as we speak. So among other actions that are needed at Santa Susana, I think you heard me refer earlier to the fact that I've reallocated resources within the department to provide more assistance to this team in order to get more work done. Look, these guys are tremendous public servants. They work in many cases every single day to ensure that everything that happens up here is done in a way that protects people, that protects workers, and that meets the standards of the 2007 and 2010 AOCs. It's my job to try and relieve some of the pressure from them, to spread the tremendous burden of all the work around. And I probably should do that even more than I have. We do have a tremendous number of sites in the state. It's a zero-sum game. I take some resources away from one site and put it on Santa Susana. So that means another community is going to have a cleanup that isn't going quite as fast. But given the importance of this site, given the need, tremendous work need, we're doing what we can with the resources that we have, reallocating those resources to get as much work done as possible.
Thank you, Grant. So this question also relates to the EIR and the closure plan. Can you please, you mentioned an EIR and approval of a closure plan. Will there be an opportunity to review and provide public comments, and will it affect our timeline? And since the draft EIR and closure plan public comment periods have come and gone, I'll ask you to just address the question of will it affect our timeline?
Is that question for Grant?
Yes. Will the EIR affect our timeline?
Are you asking me, or I'm sorry, are you asking me or are you asking Grant?
I can go ahead and take it. The EIR is not, the work on the EIR is not affecting the timeline for this work. This is an early action. This is work that would normally go after the EIR was done, the PEIR was done. What we decided is, given the exigency of the circumstances with respect to wildfire and other stochastic events, whether it be rain events that are longer and heavier due to climate change, wildfires, other situations like that where you've got buildings that are heavily contaminated, we wanted to address it. So this is an early action. It's not the final action. It is interim, but this is an early action. It's not waiting on the PEIR work to be completed.
Thanks, Grant. So this is a question about Boeing exceedances. So I'll probably ask Steve to address this. This comes from Denise Duffield. Why aren't you telling folks that Boeing reported 57 exceedances over pollution limits and stormwater runoff after the Woolsey fire, including lead, dioxin, cyanide, alpha radioactivity, which it admitted were to the fire burning vegetation and making soil contaminants more mobile?
I think I'm going to ask Laura to address that one, actually, if she's able.
Sure. Yes. So yes, there were many exceedances after the Woolsey fire. There was significant rains. I remember looking at that data, like the first quarter 2019, we were seeing exceedances. I looked at the data for the outfalls leading from Area 4. There's a number of places where there are regulated outfalls under the NPDES with the regional board. And we don't, well, as far as exceedances you're talking about, these are not at the outfalls that lead from Area 4 that go down to the north, down into the Meyer Canyon watershed. There were detects that we saw, but what they call the maximum daily limits were not exceeded at any of the outfalls. That's the FSDF, the sodium reactor experiment, the RMHF. So from Area 4 northward, those areas we saw detects, no exceedances, but elsewhere at the site, they did. And again, there was a lot of damage. The vegetation was burnt. When you burn off vegetation, you do enhance the potential for erosion. Many of these exceedances may be attributed to the damage at the site from the fire due to the erosion. But as I said, we went there later in the spring after the rains, and the area was lushly vegetated. And we've seen through time, and we're hearing the expert panel, the stormwater panel, discuss the trends in the data. They have steadily seen those exceedances decrease in magnitude, far less exceedances, and it's really it seems to be a function of the more nature recovers, vegetation comes back, that causes a natural filter, and you'll see an improvement in water quality. That is something to expect from fires, and it just takes time for the vegetation to come back. But nevertheless, once the vegetation's burned, piping was damaged, there are areas that were impacted, and that can affect the surface water. And again, that's why in Area 4, having buildings there, we really just want to get those buildings removed while we can as an early action. That's a great question. Thank you. Thanks,
Laura. This question is also for you. It's from Deb Duggar. testing for radioactive contamination, off-site testing for homes built before the meltdown that existed during the time of subsequent meltdowns were never notified. What has been done to inspect those older homes for radioactivity that would have been dispersed during the reactor venting?
I understand. That's a good question, and we had the same concerns on site too, in terms of what releases occurred through the whole period of operations, not just what happened in 1959, but over the decades of all the operations throughout Area 4. So how we approached that is we did an extensive on-site investigation from within the source areas, working outward to fully evaluate and investigate the extent, all the way to the point of going down drainage and moving off-site in the drainages. So we have the data that backs up and shows that we know the extent of contamination from the site throughout its entire operational period of history. In addition to that, there's been off-site studies as well that completely surrounding Santa Susana that we've looked at that data. And of the data that we've seen, we've not seen evidence that contaminants from SSFL have migrated off-site. If you have concern about a specific building built in a time period, we would not necessarily be involved in investigating that. Our goal is to investigate from the source areas and moving outward as far as we go for a contiguous contamination. But again, as I say, as long as we have contaminated buildings up there and the threat from fires, we can't guarantee that there might not be off-site contamination, and that's the whole reason why we really want to get this early action implemented and remove those structures now, just as while we can.
Hi, so I have a question about the 2010 AOC timeline from Martha Stewart Waite. Why have that required the cleanup by 2017? So she's asking about the 2017 deadline of the AOC. Maybe Grant, if you'd like to address this.
Sure. So the 2010 AOCs carried forward the 2017 timeline for doing cleanup. I think, as I referenced earlier, this is an extremely complex site, and in every site is unique. Every site has its own difficult, kind of particular way in which you need to approach cleanup. But this was a juggernaut for the Cold War. It had a variety of different rocket testing and nuclear, kind of experimental nuclear testing going on that caused serious contamination. Look, we want this place cleaned up last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. It is a complex process. We're shifting more resources on it to get more work done. We want it finished. This is one of the most important sites in the state. And we will continue to work every day to make certain that we are making progress in completing the cleanups and completing the investigations until it's done. That's our commitment.
Thanks, Grant. This is a question about the materials stored on site. So I'll pose this to you, Laura. It comes from Christina Walsh. After the fire, all the yellow containers in the outside storage were moved inside buildings 21 and or 22. What is the contents that will be sealed?
I'm not sure I understand the question. If you're asking what are the contents that will be sealed, but I will say that the buildings, the first step pre-demolition was to remove all hazardous substances, RCRA waste, non-RCRA hazardous waste. All of that is removed through abatement. So whatever it was, it's removed now, and that's been disposed of as low-level radioactive waste or mixed waste at a licensed low-level radioactive waste facility or mixed waste facility. The next step is to remove the remaining materials through deactivation of the structures to then allow the buildings themselves, the building materials, to be dismantled for demolition. The end result will be everything will be removed and everything will be disposed of as either low-level radioactive waste or low-level mixed radioactive waste.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to pose this question to Grant from John Luker. When will DTSC release your EIR? Do you have a date?
Yeah, John, thanks for the question. We are working on it now. We want to get the EIR, PEIR, done by the end of this year. Part of the benefit of taking early action is to get work done that needed to get done. Part of the drawback, at least procedurally, is that then you have to go back and modify a document that was a section of a document that was already completed. So it's good that we're taking this action. It's requiring additional work in other parts of the program. That's fine. There's a lot of work to be done. We're going to continue to take every opportunity to do early actions where we can, and we will concurrently continue to work on the PEIR. We want to get it done this year.
Thanks, Grant. And I think this is another question from Christina about the building, so I'll pose it to Laura. What is located inside the vaults when you seal them?
Well, what I've seen in the survey for photos, Christina, I've not seen anything located inside the vaults, but I've not seen inside the vaults, all of the vaults. So to be honest with you, on the radiological surveys that are done regularly, I would have to look at that information in terms of what's inside the vaults. The vaults themselves historically have been used for various types of storage, for liquid storage, non-hazardous liquid radioactive waste. My understanding now is there's nothing in storage in those vaults, but they are contaminated. So they will remain in the ground, and as we said, subject to cleanup for completion of closure when we do soils removal. There will be a full inventory for an understanding what's in the vaults at the time they're cleaned up, and I'm sure there is one right now. It's just I personally don't have that information on the top of my head. I'd have to go through the surveys, and we do have those surveys that have been provided to us.
Thanks, Laura. This question comes from Adam. Who is DTSC's expert on radiation that will be overseeing this cleanup? And I guess I would pose that to you, Laura.
Okay. We're doing, we are overseeing the work that DOE is doing. DOE is the radiologic expert. They have jurisdiction over the radioactive work under the Atomic Energy Act. We are overseeing that in terms of we're doing a RCRA closure. So we have oversight for hazardous materials, hazardous substances. We all have a common interest in that the closure, there's an intersection between closure for radionuclides and closure for hazardous substances, and that they're commingled. So I believe that by our expertise with dealing with hazardous substances, with their expertise with radiological, you can't really separate the two in terms of overall health and safety and doing the job right. So we have to work together fundamentally to ensure that all work is done safely. We watch them very closely. They're very much aware of the need for the radiological safety elements of their program, and we too are very much aware of the safety overall for both chemical and the rad perspective. I hope I've answered your question.
Thanks, Laura. This question is posed anonymously, and it's related to the cleanup agreement. So I will pose this to Grant. Is there any chance that DTSC could allow NASA and Boeing to get away without cleaning up to background levels as per the agreement?
Is there any way that we could let them get away without cleaning up to background? That was the question?
Yes.
Okay. The requirements are pretty clear in the 2010 AOCs. They clean up to the requirements to clean the background, lookup tables, however you want to say it. Those are the requirements that apply. We have been very consistent in stating that we are going to hold the responsible parties to meet those requirements. That's our job. That is their responsibility, and that's what will happen.
Thanks, Grant. So this question is from Ryan Valencia. and it is about safety measures during demolition. So I will pose it to Laura. This is Ryan with the Office of Assemblywoman Smith. First, thank you for your presentation this evening. Second, during demolition, are there firefighting safety measures and upgrades that will be made on site that we haven't seen before?
I cannot speak towards what specific firefighting safety measures, other than I can say that there is, as part of their general overall health and safety plan and activity hazards analysis, there's an emergency response component that's a part of the program, and that includes in the event fires should occur. But I can't speak to the specifics on like what are they doing on that end right now that hasn't been done before, other than there is an emergency response component absolutely in place. And it's actually always been in place.
Thanks, Laura. This is another question about the cleanup. It's posed anonymously. What type of trailers will be used for waste removal? Will they be open top on roll? Will they be open top roll on roll off? If so, will plastic liners be used to contain materials? What about water suppression?
My understanding from what I've seen so far on the types of trucks that they are using to remove materials from abatement, and I assume they'll continue to use this type during demolition, is one truck will have two, I call them bins. Collectively together, they make up about 80 cubic yards. So there's two containers on each truck. The demolition material, as I understand it, it will be in bulk form. It'll be reduced in size and completely enclosed within an enclosed material within the truck, and then the truck itself will be enclosed. So I think that's one part of the question. Could you tell me what the other part of the question was?
1 second to look back at it. Once I post it, I have trouble seeing it, so sorry about that. Cheryl, I have a co-moderator. Can you see? I have someone helping me. Can you see the rest of the question that Laura is responding to?
I am sorry. I posted that she had responded, and once I do that, it throws it into a different order. I'm sorry.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I apologize if I missed part of it. Please feel free to ask more if you have questions on that topic.
Okay, thank you. So this question comes from Marjorie Brown. I think it's a general departmental question, so I'm going to pose it to Grant. Does DTSC or Boeing imagine that just removing these buildings will be the end of the AOCs, that they will simply disappear?
Hi, Marjorie. Thanks for the question. So this order deals with DOE and the radioactive materials handling, basically facilities, the buildings within Area 4. We are enforcing the AOC's requirements under this order, and we will continue to do so with any DOE or NASA work at soils. Boeing is under the, in terms of soils, is under the 2007 consent order. That is just a different legal regime than applies to either NASA or DOE. So there's two different legal, and I know it gets confusing because, as I said, this is a complex site, but we are enforcing the 2010 requirements against DOE under this order, and we will continue to do so. Thank you for the question.
All right. So this question is springboarding off Ryan Valencia's question, and it comes from Jenny Knack, and it's related to the Woolsey fire. So Laura, so anyone on the project team, you can determine amongst yourselves who would like to respond. In response to Ryan Valencia's question, it would be negligent to fail to mention that the water tanks at SSFL have been removed and the up-to-date trucks removed as well. PVC piping used to move water also melted during the Woolsey fire. Have these issues been dealt with?
Yes, I could take that. There was much damage to the conveyance system, and the pipelines were severely damaged and melted. I do know that Boeing documented that, and the regional board coordinated with them and acknowledged that the damage. Boeing did take action, such that my understanding is the conveyance system was ultimately replaced. So now we have a fully functional stormwater conveyance system, but there was no intent to not mention that. I think I did mention there had been some burned pipelines, but there was considerable damage to the stormwater system, but that was outside of Area 4, so I didn't necessarily focus on that. So that you raise a good point. Fires do cause significant damage, and when you damage a stormwater system after a fire and then you have heavy rains, that brings on even more serious concern about a situation. And it's all the more reason why we want to take those buildings at RMHF and remove them as an early action. So thank you for your question and clarification.
Thanks, Laura. We have a question about monitoring during the cleanup. So I'm gonna pose this to you as well. This comes from Martha Stewart Waite. Will there be monitoring of radiation of chemicals in Runkle Canyon as removal is taking place?
Well, the approach that we're taking in terms of cleanup, and this is starting with building demolition cleanup, but it will continue for any type of cleanup of any media, whether it's buildings or soil. Air monitoring will start in terms of demolition within the work area itself for protection of the workers. There will also be, alongside with that, the perimeter air monitoring stations that we spoke of earlier. There are a number of monitoring stations that go around the perimeter of the entire site of SSFL. That monitoring is ongoing. They have 2 years of baseline monitoring. They've been continuing to monitor, and they will monitor throughout any and all cleanups. So the idea is that we're getting data within the proximity of the work area. If we see any exceedances or trends, we will absolutely coordinate with not only what's at the work area with the perimeter stations. That gives us a heads up so that we can mitigate and address the situation at the area where the work's being done. The idea is if we manage it at the work area, that it won't have a chance to go off-site. So we have the monitoring stations in place for the protection of the communities and at the work site itself and within the site boundaries.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to pose one more question. We have more questions, and Michelle's going to address how we're going to handle the additional questions that we're not going to get through tonight. But this is about the worker safety. So I'm going to pose it to Laura. It comes from Bonnie Clee. Will the workers wear monitoring badges and protective clothes?
The health and safety plan associated with the project calls for the appropriate personal protection equipment. They have the contractor, Northwind, has a radiation specialist. The health and safety plan discusses the type of monitoring that will be ongoing for the employees. So personal protective equipment is, to get into the level of detail is like, yes, it is required. They have a full-on program that is, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but they are requiring and fulfilling the requirements for California occupational safety and health. Requires an injury and illness protection program. So it's very comprehensive in that it is designed and ensure that all the workers at the site are fully informed of the hazards and the procedures to be taken such that they can comply with the requirements to ensure that they achieve full protection. So there's a number of positions in place to ensure that the workers are getting the protection that they need, that they're made aware of it. So I hope I answered your question. It's actually a very large and complex program, both in the sense of protection from radionuclide exposure as well as just overall health and safety. So I'm probably not answering exactly what you want, But if anything, I can relay to you that the magnitude of the program, it's very broad in many aspects and has many elements.
Laura, and we are 3 minutes to the end of our meeting, so I want to turn this back over to Michelle. The last thing I'm going to post right now in our Q&A is the link to our meeting evaluation. So please fill out our survey. We try to design our meetings to meet your needs, to address the questions and concerns that you have. And remote engagement is new for us, so we're working towards gaining more resources on that. So any feedback you have right now for us would be tremendous in helping us continue our engagement with you. Thanks. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you also for all of our presenters this evening. And most of all, thanks to each and every one of you for joining us. We are very appreciative. Although we couldn't get to all of the questions that were here in the Q&A this evening, I do want to let you know that we will be responding to those. Additionally, if you have additional questions, if you think of something after tonight's meeting and you have questions, please reach out to me, contact me, email me at michelle.banks-ordone@dtsc.ca.gov, or you can reach me by phone at 818-717-6573, and we will be able to document your questions and also respond to them. The reason I say we'd like to document them, because all of the questions that were asked this evening and the answers to those, as well as those that I receive regarding tonight's community meeting, will be posted to our website. And the website for DTSC Santa Susana is also posted within your question and answer section. If you were to go to your screen, I believe that is the last post you should see there as well. Lastly, we certainly would like for you to evaluate tonight's meeting. As we continue to have remote community meetings, your thoughts will help us enhance what we are doing with our meeting format. We hope that the information that has been presented to you this evening has been helpful and has answered a number of your questions. And again, we thank you. That concludes our meeting for this evening.